Duke of Lyndhurst laughed at her, and it was the last time in his life that he ever laughed at anybody. It was rent day at Lyndhurst, the great half-yearly audit, when the tenants of 900 farms came up the hill to the estate office with their money in cloth bags and their hats in their hands, and the steward sat behind the long table with the ledgers open, and the Duke sat beside him, because his father had always sat there, and it was the sort of thing a duke was supposed to do. He had been doing it for 6 years, and he found it insupportably dull. He signed what he was told to sign. He nodded where he was told to nod. The ledgers were a wall of small figures, and he had never in his life added up a column of them, because he was the Duke of Lyndhurst, and there were men paid to do that. The man paid to do that was Mr. Pargeter, the steward, a soft, sorrowful, deferential man of 50, who had served the family for 22 years, who wore a black coat gone green at the elbows, and spoke of the tenants as our poor people, and whom the Duke had trusted absolutely since he was 19 years old. The girl came in at the end of the afternoon, when the light was going and the last of the tenants were shuffling out. She was perhaps 24. She wore a brown stuff dress and a shawl and heavy boots, and she had a strong, plain, weather-marked face with a great deal of intelligence in it, and she carried, instead of a cloth bag of money, a bundle of papers tied with string. Her name, the steward said with a sigh, was Hannah Blythe, and she was Blythe of Coleridge's daughter, and Blythe of Coleridge was 4 pounds 11 shillings short and 2/4 behind, and would have to go. "I am not 4 pounds 11 shillings short," said Hannah Blythe. The Duke of Lyndhurst looked up, mildly interested for the first time in 6 hours. "Now, Hannah," said Mr. Pargeter, in the tone of a kind man being patient with a difficult child, "we have been through this at Michaelmas, and we have been through it at Lady Day. Your father's arrears are in the book. The book does not lie, my dear." "The book," said Hannah Blythe, "is wrong." There was a small, delighted stir among the last few tenants at the door. "I have kept my father's accounts since I was 11, she went on, and she said it without heat, plainly, the way a person states a fact of trade. "He cannot read, and he counts on his fingers, and I have done every figure of that farm for 13 years, and I have every receipt for every payment we have made in that time, and I have brought them." She set the string-tied bundle on the long table. "We are not 2/4 behind. We are paid to the day. Somebody has entered our Lady Day payment of last year in the book as 3 pounds when it was 7 pounds 10, and has done the same thing at Michaelmas the year before, and I have written to Mr. Pargeter about it twice, and had no answer, and now he tells me we are to be turned off the ridge my grandfather broke with his own hands. So I have come up the hill to say it out loud in front of his grace, since letters do not seem to arrive." And the Duke of Lyndhurst, 36, bored, entirely certain of the world and everyone in it, laughed. He was not, in fairness to himself, a cruel man. He was merely a man who had never once in his life been contradicted by a tenant's daughter, and the sheer improbability of the thing struck him as comic. He laughed, and he said, easily, to the room at large, "Mr. Pargeter, I believe your ledgers are being audited by a farmer's girl. Well, well." "My dear child, a woman cannot count rent. It is 900 farms and 30 years of entries, and a system of quarter days and abatements that takes a trained man a decade to learn. Your father is behind. Mr. Pargeter says so, and Mr. Pargeter has kept these books since before you were born. Take your papers home." Hannah Blythe did not take her papers home. She stood there in her brown dress and her heavy boots, in front of the Duke of Lyndhurst and his steward, and 11 tenants and 2 footmen, and she looked at him with a level, burning steadiness, and she said, "Then let a trained man count it, your grace, and let me stand here while he does. That is all I ask. I will not be turned off my father's land on the word of a book I am not permitted to see. You say a woman cannot count rent. Very well. Open the ledger to the Coleridge page, and let your trained man read out what is written there, and let me read out what is written on my receipts, and we shall all hear whether the two agree. If I am wrong, I will beg your pardon before every soul in this room and go home, and we will pay the 4 pounds 11 if we have to sell the cow. And if I am right," she paused and her chin came up, "then I would ask your grace to consider what else may be written wrong in that book, and who has been the one writing in it." The room went entirely silent, and the Duke of Lyndhurst, who had been about to say something crushing, found that he did not say it, because he had glanced, in that silence, at Mr. Pargeter, and Mr. Pargeter's soft, sorrowful face had gone the color of cold ash. The Duke of Lyndhurst was a bored man and an arrogant man, but he was not a stupid one, and he had spent 6 years in the Lords watching men's faces while other men spoke. He had seen 100 kinds of guilt cross 100 kinds of face, and he saw it now, in one unguarded second, on the face of the man who had held his family's books since before he was born. "Open the ledger," said the Duke of Lyndhurst. "Your Grace." Mr. Pargeter's voice was a thread. "It is most irregular. The girl is distressed. The estate books are not a thing to be bandied about in front of tenants." "Open the ledger," said the Duke, "to the Coleridge page, now." It took, in the end, 4 hours, and the Duke of Lyndhurst never forgot a minute of them. He sent for candles. He sent the tenants away, all but 2, who he made stay as witnesses, because he had begun to understand that he might need them. He sat Hannah Blythe down at the long table opposite him with her string-tied bundle, and he opened the great ledger himself, and he said, "Read me your receipts." She read them, in order, by quarter, 13 years of them, in a clear country voice, each one dated and signed in the steward's own hand. £7.10, Lady Day, £7.10, Michaelmas, £7.10. And the Duke of Lyndhurst read out what stood against Coleridge in the book. £3, £4, £3.10. The gap was there, written in Pargeter's hand, year after year after year. "It is a clerical error," Pargeter said, from somewhere behind him. "A slip of the pen, repeated, a carrying over. I will correct it at once, Your Grace. I am mortified."
"Sit down," said the Duke, without turning round.
And then, to Hannah Blythe, "How many farms did you say?" 900, Your Grace," she said. "You said it yourself." "And how long would it take a person," said the Duke of Lyndhurst, very slowly, "to check 900 of them?" Hannah Blythe looked at the 4 great ledgers stacked at the end of the table. She looked at the candles, and she said, "If Your Grace can find me the counterfoils and the receipt books and a great deal of paper, 3 days, perhaps 4. I would want to sleep some of it." "You cannot," said the Duke, seriously propose to audit the Lyndhurst estate. "I have audited a farm every quarter day for 13 years, said Hannah Blythe, "which is the same thing 900 times, and I am not frightened of it. Your Grace laughed at me this afternoon and said a woman cannot count rent. I have just counted it in front of you for 4 hours, and I have not made an error yet, and neither, I notice, have you found one. So I will make you a bargain, since you are a man who understands bargains. Give me the books and a room, and 4 days, and if at the end of it I have found nothing, I will go home and pay the £4.11 and never trouble you again. And if I find something—" She looked, for the first time, at Mr. Pargeter, and her plain face was terrible. "You will not turn one single family off this estate on the strength of that book, until every page of it has been read, because if he has done it to us, Your Grace, he has done it to others, and some of them cannot read at all." The Duke of Lyndhurst sat back in his chair and looked at the tenant's daughter in the brown dress across his own long table. "Mr. Pargeter," he said, without taking his eyes off her, "you will go to your house. You will not go into the estate office. You will not touch a paper. Boyce," this to the older footman, "you will go with him, and you will stay with him, and if he burns so much as a laundry list you will tell me. Miss Blythe," he stood, "you will have the little dining room, and both fires lit, and every book and counterfoil and receipt book on this estate, and as much paper as you can spoil, and a girl to bring you food, and you will be paid a clerk's wage for every day you sit there, 4 days. Hannah Blythe stood up too. She was very tired, and her hands, he noticed, were shaking now that the fight was over. "And your Grace?" she said. "His Grace," said the Duke of Lyndhurst, "will be sitting on the other side of the table, because if a man's steward has been robbing him for 22 years under his nose while he signed whatever was put in front of him, then that man is a fool, and I find I dislike being a fool very much, and I intend to learn to count rent." He looked at her, and for the first time that day there was nothing whatever of laughter in his face. You will teach me, and I will begin by begging your pardon, Miss Blythe, in front of these two witnesses and my own steward, for laughing at you this afternoon. It was the remark of an idle man who had never been made to think. You told me my book was wrong. You were right, and I was wrong, and I was insufferable about it, and I am ashamed. Nobody at Lyndhurst had ever heard the Duke beg anyone's pardon for anything. Hannah Blythe looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down and pulled the first ledger toward her and said, "Then we had better start with the far quarter, Your Grace, and work back. Sharpen a pen." He could not add. That was the discovery of the first night, and it was the single most humiliating hour of the Duke of Lyndhurst's life, and he never told anybody about it except her. He had been to Eton, and he had been to Christchurch, and he had construed Thucydides, and he had spoken twice in the House of Lords on the currency. And at 11 o'clock on the first night, sitting opposite a farmer's daughter with a column of 41 figures in front of him, he discovered that he could not add them up. He could do it slowly. That was not the trouble. He got to the bottom of the column in about 4 minutes and wrote down a total, and then Hannah Blythe, who had done the same column while he was still on the 11th line, said, without looking up, £9.6, Your Grace. He had written £8.19. He did it again. He got £9.11. He did it a third time, with his ears burning, and got £9.6, and sat back and said, "Very well, I am out of practice." "You are not out of practice," said Hannah Blythe. "You have never done it. There is a difference, and there is no shame in it, and we are going to be sitting here for 5 days, so we had better be honest about what you can do, or you will make errors, and I shall have to check everything twice, and it will take us 8. She turned the page round. "You add by reading the numbers. That is the whole difficulty. You are reading 9 and 4 and 7 and 6 as words, and then translating them into a sum, and it is like construing a language, and you are doing it beautifully, and it is 4 times too slow, and it goes wrong under fatigue." She put her finger on the column. "You do not read them. You see them. 9 and 4 is not a sum, it is a shape. Look. 9, 4, 13. 7, 6. That is 13 again. There is your 6 and 20 in the first 4 lines, and you have not added anything at all. You have only recognized 2 things you already knew." The Duke of Lyndhurst stared at the page. "Do it again," he said. She did it again. She did it for 2 hours, patiently, at 11 o'clock at night, in a little dining room, with 2 fires lit, teaching a Duke of 6 and 30 to add up a column of money the way she had been taught at 11 by a father who could not read. And at 1 in the morning he did 41 lines in under a minute and got them right. And he put down the pen and looked at the paper and said, in a voice that did not sound like his own, "I have owned 900 farms for 6 years. Hannah Blythe did not say anything. "I have owned 900 farms for 6 years, said the Duke of Lyndhurst, "and until 11 o'clock tonight, I could not have told you, if my life had depended upon it, what any one of them paid, and I have just learned to add in 2 hours from a woman who is 24 years old, and it was not difficult, and there was nothing to it, and any man on this earth could learn it in an evening." He looked up. "Why did nobody teach me?" "Because nobody had to," said Hannah Blythe. "That is not an answer. It is the only answer there is." She dipped her pen. "Your Grace, a boy who will inherit 900 farms is taught Greek, because Greek is difficult and useless, and proves that he is a gentleman. A girl who will inherit 11 acres and a cow is taught to add, because if she cannot add, they will starve in 3 years." She began the next column. "It is not a mystery. It is not a scandal. It is simply that arithmetic is a servant's accomplishment in this country, and Greek is a gentleman's, and the entire arrangement is designed by people who own things and are protected from ever having to count them." She got to the bottom of the column, £14.2, "and that is how Mr. Pargeter has had £19,000 off you, and it is why he will have another 19 off your son, unless you teach him to add." The Duke of Lyndhurst sat in the little dining room at 1 in the morning and looked at a farmer's daughter for a long time. "My son," he said, "does not exist." "Then you have time," said Hannah Blythe, and turned the page. It took her 5 days, not 4. And by the end of the second, the Duke of Lyndhurst had stopped thinking of her as a tenant's daughter at all. He had never watched a mind work before. That was the thing he could not get over. He had been at Oxford. He had sat among clever men all his life, and he had never actually seen the naked machinery of a first-rate intelligence at work on a hard problem. Because clever men at Oxford performed their cleverness, and Hannah Blythe simply used hers. She sat across the table in her brown dress, with her hair coming down and ink to the wrist, and she did not talk, and she did not explain. And every hour or so she would say something like, "The abatements are the trick of it," or "He is doing it in the years when there is a flood. Look, he is hiding it under the relief," and then go back to the columns. She had found the shape of it by the second evening. Mr. Pargeter had not been robbing the tenants. That was what the Duke had assumed, at first, and it was wrong, and Hannah made him see why it was wrong. Pargeter had been robbing the Duke, and he had been using the tenants to do it. The system was almost elegant. He collected the true rent from a farm. He entered a smaller sum in the estate ledger. He pocketed the difference. And to make the smaller sum plausible, he entered a fictitious abatement, a reduction granted for a bad harvest or a flooded field or a sick beast, against the farm's name. The estate believed the tenant had paid less because the tenant was in difficulties. The tenant believed he had paid in full and had the receipt to prove it. Both halves of the lie were airtight, and they could only be caught by laying the receipt against the ledger, farm by farm, which no one had ever done, because the man who would have had to do it was Mr. Pargeter. "And then," said Hannah, on the fourth night, very quietly, when a family began to notice, when someone like me wrote him a letter, he had one more move. He let their arrears build in the book, and then he went to your Grace and said, sorrowfully, that the Blythes of Cold Ridge were behind and would have to go. And you would have signed it, your Grace. You would have signed it without looking, and we would have been off the ridge by Lady Day, and there would have been no one left who could have proved anything, because the only proof was in my apron, and I would have been on the road." The Duke of Lyndhurst put down his pen. "How many?" he said. Hannah turned the paper around and pushed it across to him. 900 farms, 260 of them touched. 11 families turned off the estate in 6 years on false arrears. Turned off, some of them, into the workhouse. One of them onto a road in February, with a sick woman in the cart. 22 years of it, so far as the books ran back. And a total, in the round, of something a little over £19,000. The Duke of Lyndhurst looked at the sheet in the candlelight for a long time. "I signed every one," he said. 11 families. He put the paper in front of me and said, "These people are behind, your Grace." And I signed it, and went out to look at a horse. I never asked. I never once asked to see the figures. I did not ask because I could not have read them if he had shown me, because I had never learned, because I am a duke, because there are men paid to do that. He set the paper down. And there is a woman sitting in my little dining room who did the arithmetic that I was too grand to do, and who was called a liar for it, and laughed at, by me, in front of her neighbors, and who has just handed me the ruin of my own steward, and the names of 11 families I put on the road. He stood up and walked to the window, and stood with his back to her. "Do not," he said, "be gentle with me, Miss Blythe. I have had gentleness from Pargeter for 22 years, and it cost me £19,000 and 11 families. Tell me what you think of me, plainly, as you told me on rent day." Hannah Blythe was silent a while. Then she said, "I think you are not a wicked man. I think you are an idle one, and I think idleness in a great man is not a small sin, your Grace, because it is paid for by little people. You did not steal from anybody, but you built a house with no lock on the door, and then went out riding for 6 years, and a thief walked in, and the people who were hurt were not you." She paused. "And then, on rent day, when a girl in boots stood up and told you the truth, you laughed at her, and then, 4 hours later, you begged her pardon in front of witnesses, and sat down at the table, and asked her to teach you to count. I have thought a great deal about those 4 hours these 5 days, and I will tell you what I think of you, since you asked. I think that most men in England, having been contradicted by a farmer's daughter, would have had her put out of the room to save their pride, and would have gone on signing whatever Pargeter put in front of them until they died. You did not. You looked at the man's face, and you looked at my papers, and you chose the truth over your own dignity in about 10 seconds, and you have not stopped choosing it for 5 days, and it has cost you a great deal to do it. That is not idleness. That is the opposite. I think you are a man who has been asleep, Your Grace, and has just woken up, and I think what you do in the next month will decide what you are for the rest of your life, and I have no idea what you will do, and I find that I mind very much what you will do, which is not a thing I expected to feel about a duke. What the Duke of Lyndhurst did in the next month became a thing that was talked about in that county for 40 years. He saw Pargeter once before the trial, alone, in the estate office, on the 6th morning, with the 4 ledgers on the table between them. He had told himself he was going to be cold. He had rehearsed it. And what he was not remotely prepared for was that Mr. Pargeter, soft, sorrowful, deferential, in the black coat gone green at the elbows, sat down opposite him and explained himself, at length, with complete sincerity, and believed every word of it. 22 years, Your Grace, he said. 22 years I have sat in this room. I came to your father as underclerk at £19 a year, and I have never in all that time been raised above 90, and I have run this estate. Run it, sir, entirely. The rents and the repairs and the leases and the timber and the tithes and the quarter days, while your father shot birds, and your father's father drank, and no man has ever once looked at what I did, or thanked me for it, or asked me a question about it. His voice had a terrible, reasonable warmth in it. I did not steal from those people. I want that understood, and I want it in the record, and I shall say it in the court. Not one tenant is a farthing worse off by my hand. They paid what they always paid, and they had their receipts, and I never asked one of them for a penny more. You put 11 families on the road. I put 11 families on the road, Pargeter agreed, because the arrears had to be somewhere, sir, and they could not be in the ledger and nowhere else. That is arithmetic. It is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. He spread his soft hands. And do you know what I have thought about these 6 years, every time I brought you one of those papers? I have thought, he will ask. This time he will look at it. This time he will say, Pargeter, are you quite sure about the Rudds? And I shall have to answer him, and it will be over. He leaned forward, and his eyes were wet, and he was, the Duke of Lyndhurst realized with horror, entirely earnest. And you never asked. Not once, Your Grace. Not one single time in 6 years did you look at a name. You signed 11 families out of their homes without reading them, and went out to look at a horse. He sat back. I do not say it to excuse myself. I say it because it is the truth, and I have carried it a long while. I was a thief, and you were a man who could not be bothered. And between the two of us, sir, I have often wondered which is worse, and I have never been able to decide. The Duke of Lyndhurst sat in his own estate office and could not speak. You will send me to Botany Bay, said Mr. Pargeter, standing up and straightening the green elbows of his coat with a curious dignity. Quite properly. I shall not defend it, and I shall not make you a scene. He picked up his hat. But I shall tell you what you have really lost, Your Grace, since you are about to find out, and would rather hear it from me. You have lost the only man in England who knew how this estate actually worked. Nobody else knows. Not your agent, not your lawyer, not you. 22 years of it is in my head and nowhere else. And there is not one page of instruction anywhere in this building, and I took very good care that there should not be. He went to the door. That was not carelessness either. That was the whole of my security, and it is why I have been safe for 22 years, and it is why your father raised me from £19 to 90 and never dared to raise me further, because he knew, and he was frightened of me, and he preferred not to look. He paused with his hand on the door. Whom will you put in this room? He said, quite gently. Who is there? You cannot add, sir. You could not have caught me, and you did not catch me. A girl in boots caught me, with a bundle of receipts, in a room full of tenants, because she was going to lose her father's farm, and she will not stay. Girls in boots do not stay. She will marry a farmer at Michaelmas and be gone. He opened the door, and you will have to hire another Pargeter, and you will not look at his ledgers either. because you never do. And in 20 years, you will be sitting in that chair, signing another 11 families onto another road, and going out to look at another horse." He went out, and the Duke of Lyndhurst sat alone in the estate office with the 4 ledgers for an hour and a half, and then got up and went to the little dining room and stood in the doorway looking at a farmer's daughter and 4 clerks rebuilding 22 years of accounts from the receipts up. "Miss Blythe," he said, "come out into the passage. I have something to ask you, and I find I cannot ask it in front of anybody." He did not have Pargeter hanged, though he could have, and he wanted to. He prosecuted him, coldly and completely, and saw him transported, and made no effort whatever to hush it up, which shocked the neighborhood far more than the theft did, because the neighborhood's opinion was that a great man ought to dismiss a thieving steward quietly and let it be forgotten, rather than stand up in open court and admit before the whole county that he had been robbed under his nose for 22 years because he was too proud to add up a column of figures. The Duke of Lyndhurst stood up and admitted it. He said, on the record, that the fault was as much his own as his steward's, that a man who will not do his own accounts has no business owning 900 farms, and that he intended to say so publicly, precisely because it was humiliating, and because he deserved to be humiliated. Then he found the 11 families. It took 4 months, and it cost him a good deal of money, and some considerable trouble, and 2 of them he could not find at all, and 1 had died. The other 8 he found, in workhouses, in a Manchester cellar, in a cousin's back room in Liverpool, and he went himself, in every case but one, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and told them what had been done to them, and what he had signed, and that he had signed it without looking, and he brought them home. He gave back the farms where he could, and better farms where he could not, and he paid them the arrears they had never owed, with 6 years' interest, and he did not ask any of them to forgive him, because, as he said to Hannah afterward, a man who asks to be forgiven is really asking to be let off, and he had not the smallest intention of being let off. Hannah went with him to Manchester, and it was in Manchester that the Duke of Lyndhurst finally understood what he had signed. The family was called Rudd. They had held a farm at Wexley Bottom for 4 generations, and Pargeter had built their arrears out of nothing over 2 years, and in the February of 1817, the Duke of Lyndhurst had put his name to a paper turning them off it, and had then gone out to look at a horse. He remembered the horse. He remembered it perfectly, a gray, unsound. He had not bought it. He did not remember the paper at all. They found the Rudds in a cellar off a court behind Ancoats, 4 steps down, 1 room, a window at the level of the street, so that all day long the boots of strangers went past at the height of your head. There had been 6 of them when they left Wexley Bottom. There were 4 now. The old man had died in the first winter, and the youngest had died in the second, of the fever that lived in that court. And Mrs. Rudd, who had been a farmer's wife with a dairy and a garden and a settle by a fire, was 41 and looked 60, and she stood up when the Duke of Lyndhurst came down the 4 steps into her cellar, and dropped him a curtsy, because he was the Duke, and one curtsied. That curtsy was the worst thing that ever happened to him. He stood in that cellar, with his hat in his hands, and told them the truth, all of it, the false abatements, the ledger, the 22 years, the 11 families, and that Pargeter had put a paper in front of him, in February of 1817, saying that the Rudds of Wexley Bottom were behind and must go, and that he had signed it, without reading it, without asking a single question, and had gone out to look at a horse. He did not soften it. He did not say he had been deceived, though he had been. He said, "I signed it. I did not look. Your farm and your father and your child are on my hands, and no one made me do it. And I could have prevented it by spending 10 minutes of my life on a column of figures, and I did not spend them, because I did not think anything down here was my business." And Mrs. Rudd, who had been standing all this while with her red hands folded, said the thing that he carried for the rest of his life. She said, We knew we weren't behind, your grace. My husband walked up that hill 3 times to say so, and Mr. Pargeter's man turned him back at the gate, and the 3rd time he stood in the road and shouted it, and they set the dogs on. So we knew. We just couldn't prove it. and there wasn't anybody would listen to a man in a smock stood in a road. She looked at him without hatred, which was somehow far more terrible than hatred. That's the whole of it, Your Grace. It was never that we couldn't count. It was that nobody would let us do the counting where it was written down. The Duke of Lyndhurst could not answer her. It was Hannah who answered. Hannah, who had walked up that same hill with a bundle of receipts and had been laughed at and had refused to go home. Mrs. Rudd, she said, I am Blythe of Coldridge's daughter, and I kept our books, and they built our arrears the same as yours, and by rights, I should be sitting in a cellar in Manchester, and you should never have been found. The only difference between your family and mine is that I got a hearing. That is all. Not cleverness, not virtue, a hearing. She turned and looked steadily at the Duke, and her voice was not gentle. And he gave it to me. He laughed at me first, and I will hold that against him till I die, and I have told him so. But he gave it to me. And then he sat at that table 5 days and did the arithmetic himself, and then he came down 4 steps into this cellar with his hat off. He is not asking you to forgive him. He has told me to my face that he does not want to be forgiven because he thinks being forgiven is a way of being let off. She stopped. But he has come, ma'am, and there are great men in this country who would have burned that ledger and never come at all. They brought the Rudds home. They gave them Wexley Bottom, and the stock, and the arrears with 6 years' interest, and a headstone in the churchyard at Lyndhurst for the 2 who had died in Ancoats, that last at the Duke's own insistence, and he stood at the setting of it, bareheaded, in the rain, for a long time after everyone else had gone. Hannah found him still there, and stood beside him, and did not say anything. I want you to tell me, he said at last, if I ever go back to sleep, not gently, as you told me on rent day, in front of the footman. Will you promise me that? Your Grace, said Hannah Blythe, I have been telling great men uncomfortable truths in loud voices since I was 11 years old, and it is the only accomplishment I have got. She looked at the small new stone in the rain. Yes, I promise, and you will find that I am extremely good at it. The county did not forgive him, and it did not forgive her, and it took 4 years. He had expected the county to be shocked by Pargeter. It was not shocked by Pargeter. It was, on the whole, rather sympathetic to Pargeter. A poor devil, 90 a year, 22 years, and one must say the temptation was very great, and it reserved its actual outrage, which was considerable and sustained, for 2 entirely different things. The first was that the Duke of Lyndhurst had stood up in open court and admitted, on the record, that he could not add. Nobody in that county ever forgave him for it. It was not merely eccentric. It was, they felt, a kind of treason. Because if a duke stands up in a public courtroom and says that a man who owns 900 farms and cannot read a column of figures has no business owning them, then every squire in the West riding with an agent and a ledger, and a comfortable ignorance is being spoken to, and knows it, and does not care to be. 3 men cut him at the assizes. His own cousin wrote him a letter of 6 pages about the dignity of the family, and the Duke of Lyndhurst read it, and answered it in 1 line. I was robbed for 6 years because I was too grand to do arithmetic, and I intend to say so until somebody in this county goes and looks at his own books, and posted it, and made an enemy for life. The second thing the county could not forgive was Hannah Blythe. Not that he had employed her. A great man may employ any curiosity he pleases. That she had authority. That was the intolerable thing. The Duke of Lyndhurst had given a tenant farmer's daughter of 24 the standing power to open any book on the estate, without asking anybody's leave, including his own. And it meant that when she walked into the agent's office at Lyndhurst on a Tuesday morning in her brown dress and her heavy boots, and asked to see the timber accounts, the agent had to give her the timber accounts. They tried everything. They tried ignoring her, and she waited. They tried patronizing her, and she took no notice whatever. They tried the thing that always works, which was to be personal. And in the 2nd year, a Mr. Craddock of Ledworth, who was a magistrate and a fool, said something at a public dinner about the Duke of Lyndhurst's arithmetic mistress, and got the laugh he was hoping for. The Duke of Lyndhurst did not challenge him, and did not ruin him, and did not say anything at all. Hannah Blythe wrote to him. It was a letter of 11 pages, and it was not about herself. It was a complete audit of the Ledworth Turnpike Trust, of which Mr. Craddock was treasurer, and which she had gone through, on her own time, over 3 weeks, out of the public accounts that any subscriber might inspect, and that nobody ever had. And it demonstrated in her clear country hand, with the folios noted, that Mr. Craddock had been taking a commission on the gravel contracts for 9 years, and that it came to £480, and that it was all perfectly recorded, and had simply never been added up. She sent a copy to Mr. Craddock. She sent no copy to anybody else. And she wrote, at the bottom, "Sir, I have not sent this to the papers, and I do not intend to. I am told you called me the Duke's arithmetic mistress at a public dinner, and that 11 gentlemen laughed. I am writing to tell you that I heard, and that I did the sum, and that I have it, and that I am going to do nothing whatever with it. You may sit with that for as long as you like. H. Blythe." Mr. Craddock repaid the £480 to the trust within the month, describing it as an error in the bookkeeping, and was never rude about anybody again as long as he lived. And the story of what she had done got about the county in the way such stories do, and after that, the agents at Lyndhurst produced the timber accounts rather promptly. The Duke of Lyndhurst found out about it 2 years later, by accident, and went and stood in the doorway of the little dining room and said, "Craddock, the Turnpike Trust, you did the whole thing in 3 weeks and you never told me." "No," said Hannah Blythe, not looking up. "Why not?" She put down her pen. "Because you would have destroyed him," she said. "You would have taken it to the papers and had him off the bench inside a month, and you would have been quite right, and it would have been the most satisfying thing you ever did." She sat back, and every soul in this county would have said, "There, the Duke has ruined a magistrate because somebody was rude about his lady auditor, and that would have been the end of me, Your Grace. Not the end of Craddock, the end of me. I should have been a woman who is protected, a woman you cannot be rude about because of what he will do to you, and I have spent 4 years being a woman who is right, which is a great deal harder and a great deal better, and I was not going to hand it away over a dinner table joke." The Duke of Lyndhurst leaned against the doorframe. "And so instead, you audited a turnpike trust in your own time," he said, "and sent him the sum, and told him you were going to do nothing about it." "It was more frightening," said Hannah Blythe, "and it cost you nothing. And it made the point rather better, I think, than a paragraph in the Leeds Mercury." She picked up her pen. "He knows what I am now. So does everybody at that dinner. They have all had it explained to them, quietly, by Mr. Craddock, over 4 years, in the way that only a very frightened man can explain a thing. And every week of those 4 months, he came back to the little dining room at Lyndhurst, where Hannah Blythe now sat at the head of the table, with 4 clerks under her, rebuilding 22 years of the estate's accounts, from the receipts up. He had made her the estate's auditor. There was no such post. He invented it. The county was scandalized, which he enjoyed. She had a salary and a room, and the 4 clerks, and the standing authority to open any book on the estate without asking anyone's leave, including his. And on the day he offered it to her, she had said, with that levelness he had come to love, "Your Grace, if you are doing this because you feel guilty, do not. Guilt makes bad appointments, and it does not last. Do it, because I am the best person in this county to do it, or do not do it at all." And he had said, "Miss Blythe, I have watched you for 5 days, and I have never seen anything done so well in my life. I am doing it because you are the best person in England to do it, and because I am not so idle as I was, and I have every intention of being a duke who is very hard to rob." And she had laughed, the first time he had heard her laugh, and taken the post. He fell in love with her over ledgers, which is not how it is done in novels, and he did not notice it happening. He noticed the day she was ill. She had a fever for a week in the autumn, and he found that the estate office was intolerable, and the little dining room was intolerable, and that he stood at his own window 3 times a day, looking down toward the ridge, and that when he was told she was better, he sat down on the stairs like a boy. He was 36 years old. He had been considered one of the great matrimonial prizes of England since he was 19, and he had never once felt anything of the kind for any of the beautiful, well-dowered, exquisitely mannered young women who had been presented to him in London drawing rooms for 17 years, and he was in love with a farmer's daughter in a brown dress, who had made him beg her pardon in front of his own footman. He went to Coldridge in the second summer, and it was her father who undid him. Blythe of Coldridge was 61, and could not read and counted on his fingers, and he had broken the top 40 acres of that ridge with his own hands as a young man, following his own father's line, and he had never in his life spoken to a duke. He was extremely rude. "I," he said, when the Duke of Lyndhurst had been standing in his yard for about 4 minutes, explaining, with some difficulty, that he had come to see the farm. "Well, Thaw's here now," and he went on with the gate he was mending, and did not offer him a chair or a drink or anything else, and let a duke stand in a farmyard in the sun for a quarter of an hour holding his own hat. The Duke of Lyndhurst took his coat off and helped him with the gate. He was no use whatever. He said so, cheerfully, and Blythe agreed with him, at length, and told him he was holding it wrong. And they got the gate up in about an hour, and at the end of it, the old man straightened his back and looked at him and said, "Tha signed to paper." "Yes." £4.11. 2 quarters behind. Blythe wiped his hands on his smock. "Our Hannah walked up that hill which receipts, and I told her not to." "Did she tell thee that?" He looked at the Duke of Lyndhurst steadily. "I told her. They'll not listen, lass, and they'll turn thee off and laugh at thee, and we's better off gooin' quiet. 61 year I've been on this ridge and end. That's what I told my own daughter. Goo quiet." He picked up his hammer. "She went any road," he said. Antha laughed at her. "Yes," said the Duke of Lyndhurst. "I did. I." Blythe of Coldridge nodded slowly, and then sat down. He turned and looked out over the top 40 acres, at the wall his father had built, in the summer light. "That's t'othing tha sees," he said, in a different voice altogether. "I've been on this land 61 year and on. I've had 4 dukes and 3 agents and a parliament, and not one of 'em has ever sat down." He put the hammer in his belt. "Tha can laugh. Everybody laughs. Laughin's nowt. It's what a man does. I'd 4 hours after, and tha sat down at yon table wi' a lass in boots and a candle, and tha counted." He turned round. "There's not a man in England 'ud have done it. I'd not have done it, my son." And Blythe of Coldridge, who could not read, and who had told his own daughter to go quiet, put out his hard hand to the Duke of Lyndhurst, and shook it once, and said, "Tha'll want the tea." The Duke of Lyndhurst drove back to Lyndhurst that night in the long summer dusk, and did not speak to his groom the whole way, and sat up until 2 in the morning in the estate office, with the 4 ledgers, doing nothing, looking at them. And somewhere about 1 o'clock, he understood what he was going to have to do about Hannah Blythe, and why he could not simply ask her, and it took him another 11 months to build. He said nothing for a year. He was afraid of exactly one thing, and it was not the county. "You cannot say it," he told her at last, on the ridge above Coldridge Farm, in a wind, with the whole estate laid out below them, because he had walked her up there on some pretext, and had abandoned the pretext at the top. "That is the trouble, Hannah, and I have turned it over for a year, and I cannot get round it. I implore you. I made the post. I pay the salary. I can end it in a morning. If I say what I have come up here to say, and you do not want it, you will not be able to tell me so freely, because you will be standing there, calculating what it costs your family, and your clerks, and the 11 families, and every tenant on this estate, who is safe now, because you are watching the books. You will say yes to protect all of that, and I would rather never speak at all than be said yes to by a woman who cannot afford to say no." He turned to her. "So I have done something first, and I have brought the paper up the hill with me, and it is signed and witnessed, and it is yours, whatever happens in the next 5 minutes." He put it into her hand. "It makes the auditorship a life appointment, at your salary, removable only by the trustees of the estate, and not by the Duke, not by me, not by my heirs, not by anybody who holds this title. If you tell me in 1 minute's time to go to the devil and never speak to you again, you will still be sitting at that table on Monday, and I shall be the one who has to find a new road home. There, now you can afford to say no to me. Now, and only now, I can ask." Hannah Blythe stood on the ridge her grandfather had broken with his own hands. holding a paper that made her, at 26, unsackable, and looked at the Duke of Lyndhurst. "You have thought about this," she said unsteadily. "For a year. I have thought about very little else for a year, and it has made me an extremely poor conversationalist, and my aunt is worried about me. Hannah," he took off his hat, "I laughed at you. On rent day, in front of your neighbors, I laughed at you and told you a woman could not count rent, and you stood there in your boots and did not move an inch, and you have been teaching me ever since, about the books, and about the tenants, and about 11 families, and about the exact difference between a man who is asleep and a man who is awake. I am awake, you woke me. I would like to spend the rest of my life being married to the person who woke me, and being useful, and being very hard to rob. That is my whole offer. I have no cleverness left to dress it up in." Hannah Blythe looked down at the paper in her hand. Then she folded it, quite deliberately, and put it away in her apron pocket, and looked up. "Keep it," she said. "The paper. I mean to hold you to it. I want that auditorship whatever happens, and I want it in writing, and I want it for the next woman too, when I am dead and gone and some fool of a steward tries it on again." Her plain face broke into the widest smile he had ever seen on it. "And yes, yes, Your Grace, I will marry you. I would have said yes a year ago, and been unable to prove to myself that I meant it, and you gave me a piece of paper so that I could." She began to laugh, and then to cry a little, and then to laugh again. "Do you know what you have just done? You have paid me the greatest compliment of my life. Not the offer, the paper. Every man who ever wanted a poor woman took care to make sure she could not refuse him. You are the only man in England who has ever gone to that much trouble to make certain that I could." They were married in the spring, and the county came, and had a great deal to say, and said it quietly, because the Duke of Lyndhurst had developed a way of looking at people over rent day that discouraged commentary. There was one more thing, and she asked for it on the morning of the wedding, in the vestry, in her own boots, and it was the only time in her life that anybody ever saw Hannah Blythe frightened. "Rent day," she said. He did not understand. "Rent day," said Hannah Blythe. "The half-yearly audit. 900 farms come up that hill with their money in bags and their hats in their hands, and the steward sits behind the long table with the ledgers open, and the Duke sits beside him, because his father always did." She was gripping her own hands together very hard. "I sat at the bottom of that table 2 years ago in a brown dress with a bundle of receipts, and you laughed at me in front of my neighbors, and in 4 hours I shall be a duchess, and in October there will be another rent day, and I shall have to sit somewhere. You will sit beside me." "No," said Hannah Blythe. "That is what I have come to say, and it is why I could not say it in front of anybody." She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet, which he had seen exactly twice. "If I sit beside you at that table, then every single soul who comes up that hill sees a duchess sitting where the Duke's wife sits, and I am finished. I am finished as an auditor, and I am finished as a Blythe, and I am finished as the one person in this county that a frightened man with a bundle of receipts might walk 11 miles to speak to." Her voice cracked. "They will not come to me. Don't you see it? They will come to the lady, and the lady is no use to anybody." The Duke of Lyndhurst stood in the vestry of a parish church on the morning of his wedding, and understood, at last, the whole of what he was marrying. "Then where," he said, "do you want to sit?" "At the end," said Hannah Blythe. "At the far end of the long table, on the left, with the books open in front of me, and my own pen and my own ink, where the steward used to sit, where the person sits who actually reads the ledger." Her chin came up. "I want the seat, Lyndhurst. Not the chair beside yours, the seat. And I want it entered in the estate book that the auditor of this estate sits at the foot of the table on rent day, and that the Duchess of Lyndhurst holds that office in her own right, and not as your wife. And that when I am dead, the office does not die with me, and does not go to your son. It goes to whoever can do the work, and if that is a farmer's girl in boots, then it is a farmer's girl in boots, and no Duke of Lyndhurst may say otherwise. Forever." She was crying, now, furiously, in a vestry, in a wedding gown she had refused to have made in London. "That is the whole of what I want out of you," she said. I do not want the diamonds, and I do not want London, and I do not care in the smallest degree about being a duchess, and I never shall. I want the seat at the foot of the table, in writing, in perpetuity, because there is a girl somewhere on this estate at this minute, 11 years old, doing her father's books because he cannot, and in 20 years, she is going to walk up that hill with a bundle of receipts, and I want her to look down that table and see somebody sitting at the bottom of it who will listen to her. The Duke of Lyndhurst went and found the parish clerk, and borrowed his pen, and wrote it on the back of the marriage register, badly, in a shaking hand, 10 minutes before his own wedding, and signed it, and made the clerk and the curate witness it, and had it drawn up properly by his lawyer in the June, and enrolled in Chancery in the August, over the objections of 4 separate men. It is still there. It has never been broken. And every half year for 31 years, on rent day, at the long table in the estate office at Lyndhurst, the Duchess of Lyndhurst sat at the foot of the table on the left, with the ledger open, and her own pen, and her own ink, and her boots under her chair, and her husband sat at the head of it, and said very little, and watched the door. And for 31 years, the Duchess of Lyndhurst audited her husband's estate herself, and no steward ever stole a shilling from it again, and she taught the tenants' daughters their figures in the little dining room on Saturday mornings, every one of them free, for 3 decades, because, as she told them, on the first Saturday of every quarter, without fail, there is a book somewhere with your name in it, and one day somebody will tell you, it says a thing you know it does not say. Learn your figures, and go up the hill, and say so out loud. They may laugh at you. She would look, then, at the Duke, who could always be found leaning in the doorway at the back of the room on a Saturday morning, having found some entirely transparent excuse to be there. One of them laughed at me. He has been apologizing for it for 30 years, and I have not let him stop.